And yes, the title, I do believe, is what is important for the presentation. It is the harm from COVID-19 has been very bad to the world economy and to steel, probably not more than other areas. Actually, the worst impacted area has clearly been in services, restaurants, hotels, travel, but manufacturing and construction have been harmed badly, and therefore steel has been harmed badly. The effect has been very different around the world, and I'm going to start this first slide really is the point of my entire presentation. The unevenness of the production cuts and what it means for pricing, demand, et cetera. Starting on the left side, these are the actual production numbers from the world steel, and the green line is China, and it's the actual monthly numbers multiplied by 12 to come up with an annual rate. Chinese production is very, very seasonal. It always falls during cold weather because of construction and because of the Chinese New Year, so it always falls in January and February. But it's important to note that in China, COVID was at its worst in January and February, and yet production didn't fall as far as it did in 2019. And China has recovered from COVID and it is producing 10% more steel than it has. China produced about 1 billion tons of steel per year since about 2017 through 2019. They're on pace to produce 1.1 billion tons of steel. The rest of the world is in gray. And as you can see, it has trended downward from 900 million to 800 million. COVID hit, production fell almost 25% and has not fully recovered. The bottom line on the left is Asia except China. So it would be everything from India to South Korea and Japan and all of Southeast Asia. It has nearly recovered. Important point here, with China producing 10% more steel than it did in 2019 pre-COVID, China is actually importing, something they did very little of since about 2005. Now, Chinese imports have backed off in the most recent months, but for much of the summer, China was a net importer, and that lifted the rest of Asia. So Asia is doing much better than the rest of the world. It's really China-led. There are other Asian countries, some of them are doing better, some are doing worse, but China is doing much better. When we go to the right, we're not looking at tonnage now. What we're looking at is the black line was the annual average of production in 2019. And what I'm trying to do is compare many regions and say, how are they doing compared to 2019? Has tonnage recovered or not? Former Soviet Union, Commonwealth of Independent States, tonnage is just like it was. Now, it's not nearly as large a producer as Europe or North America, but it is a large producer. Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and production is basically flat. It's up, it's down, but it's pretty much recovered. South America declined very badly in April during the heart of COVID, but came back strongly. The important things for many of the people on this call would be North America and the EU 28. We are only at 80% of production levels in North America. We're only at 85% of pre-COVID levels in the EU 28. That means that capacity is sitting idle and can be restarted. This capacity has not been dynamited. It has not been bulldozed. It could be restarted, but it hasn't. And it is creating tightness in markets when there's excess idle capacity. And that is a strange thing to be happening. A little bit on the demand side. Looking at some of the flash PMIs, I work for IHS Markit. Markit is a company that does the sectoral purchasing manager indexes. And it's showing we had a very quick recovery in the United Kingdom, but then it has trailed back down. Now, the way to read this index is 50 is for every 50 companies producing more, 50 companies are producing less. So the Japanese number fell down to about 25. For every 25 companies doing more, 75 were doing less. Very bad numbers. Japan has still not gotten back up to the 50 line. We're at about 45 companies producing more, 55 producing less. Europe got into positive territory, but is deteriorating rapidly as we are doing another wave of COVID lockdowns. The United States has probably locked down less than any other region, so the United States is still positive. Now, I want to make it very clear, this does not mean the United States is larger than pre-COVID. When you fall into the Grand Canyon, then you start climbing out of it. It still takes a long time to get out. And what this is a measure of change. Things are growing. It is not saying they are back to where they were before. Manufacturing is growing in the United States. It is not back to pre-COVID levels, but at least things continue to improve. But in the some of these other key regions, things are actually getting worse again. And on the right side, we're looking at the containment indexes. And this is how much is a country locked down. And using Italy in kind of the brown, in March and April, Italy said everybody stays home. They shut down the economy completely, and Spain almost did. So that's an index level of 100. If you look across into the current, lockdowns have been largely lifted. Now they are coming back, particularly in Europe. Very strict lockdowns in France, in UK, in Eurozone, but less in China, less in Japan, and less in United States, which is in blue. And we actually see these being lifted. You lock down now, you hopefully can partially lift by December, but this is assuming that infection rates get better. And so far they're not turning. So the risk is that these measures do not get better in December, but instead they stay flat or get even more stringent. Finally, it's about COVID, and then I'll interpret what it means for steel. Vaccine. There is a lot of optimism in the market. Commodities markets are, copper is at very high prices, aluminum is at very high prices, steel is at very high prices, iron ore, metallurgical coal. If you look at a commodity other than petroleum, it's at a very high price, and even petroleum has recovered quite a bit. Everyone believes the vaccine will solve everything. Well, the vaccine will make things much better in the second half of 2021. It will have very little actual positive impact in the first half. It will start going to medical professionals, to nursing homes, and then probably to police and security. The broad economy will not start getting the vaccine until the middle of the year, and it will not start generally helping actual economic activity until the second half of the year. So we are looking at COVID has resurged, and it is harming the first quarter. It is going to continue even as measures are lifted. They will still be in place, but getting less stringent. So the fourth quarter is being hurt now. The first quarter of next year will be hurt directly, and things will hopefully start being lifted by the second quarter, but the vaccine doesn't help until the second half of the year. So we are looking at least the first quarter of next year still having weak demand in almost every region. If it's weak now, it will still be weak in the first quarter. It will take mid-2021 to really start doing it in wealthier countries. India's population is so high, and the number of doctors per 1,000 people is lower than in many other regions. It will take 2 to 3 years to immunize India. So India was one of the strongest growth stories in the world until COVID. India will suffer several years of not declines, but slower growth as COVID is dealt with. So disparity across countries persist into 2022 and beyond. So there will be growing tension as some regions recover quickly and some do not. And the ones who do not recover quickly probably will not be happy. So it does have a negative impact on steel. It does have a negative impact on economies. Now, the steel is so different, I have to break it into two regions, China and Asia and everyone else. I'll go over China and Asia pretty quickly. It's a fairly simple story. Demand has fully recovered in China, and it's dragging up the rest of Asia. So this is particularly steel, even more so than other things, because again, people in Asia have been exporting to China. That is not normal and it will not continue, but it has been a story for 2020. Supply has been able to beat demand because mills fully reopened. If they idled in February and March, they fully reopened. So they can meet demand because they are producing at a very high level. Prices quickly recovered to pre-pandemic levels. They fell from about 480 to 490 a metric ton to around 420, 430. They surged back up to 480, 490 in a very short span in June and July. They stabilized until October, and now they've gone up again, and they're over $500 a ton generally in Asia. Now, part of that is exchange rate driven. There was a period where prices rose about $20 a ton when in US dollars, but fell about 4% in RMB because the US dollar has weakened so dramatically. It was 7.2 RMB per dollar in July. It's down to about 6.55. This has made Chinese steel more expensive, US steel less expensive into the region. It is making exports to the US less favorable. But you are seeing there, but even in local currency, now prices are rising. The rest of the world, demand is not up to pre-pandemic levels. As I said, it fell dramatically. Energy, aircraft, non-residential construction, and most machinery categories are weak. In general, they are at best 85% of where they were pre-COVID. Energy and aircraft are far worse. They're about 50% or less. Motor vehicles have recovered strongly. That is the bright spot, and that's part of why sheet is the strongest of all the products. Motor vehicles are basically back to their pre-COVID run rate. They shut down almost completely in April. They're back to pre-COVID run rates. They'll probably drop back a little bit next year. They're kind of filling in for inventory that was not made in April, and they will stabilize going forward at levels about 5% to 10% below the 2015 to 19 norm. And that is a global phenomenon: China, Japan, South Korea, Europe, North America. Motor vehicles are strong, but they're not exceeding where they were. Supply is confusing. Production has not recovered. Going back to that first graph, if you look at the blue line and the green line, again, we have idle capacity. We're only about 80% to 85% of the pre-COVID levels. So you have tight markets because tonnage is down. That creates a seller's market, and it is very definitely a seller's market. But they have idle capacity, and normally idle capacity means a buyer's market. The thing is, they're just not restarting that capacity. And where is most of that capacity? It is mostly blast furnace sheet makers, people who would generally serve the automotive market. They are very scared that COVID will come back. It is expensive to relight a furnace. It is time consuming to relight a blast furnace. They're scared they'll relight it. COVID will come back, so they're not bringing them back online, but it is making markets very tight. Prices are mostly recovered to pre-pandemic levels. But variation is wide between regions and between products. Carbon, flat is generally stronger than bar. Sheet is overpriced in the United States and is likely to relapse. I believe that idle capacity will be restarted, and once it does, there will be more tonnage and prices will relapse. Moreover, prices are now, we'll come to show it in a moment, prices are now well above the 25% tariff, and imports are starting to tick up. That brings me, and special and bar is much more sedate. Special and alloy, there's not a lot of market information, but we know it is down because some of its major end markets are aircraft and energy. It should be a buyer's market with idle capacity, but it is now really more of a seller's market because there is capacity offline. That is mostly true for sheet. Input cost, iron ore, very high. It will fall. It is actually just going over 130, but that is an excessive price. The cost of extraction is far lower. Mines are being expanded. There will be supply coming online in 2021 and iron ore prices will fall. But right now, blast furnaces are at a disadvantage compared to scrap. Scrap was very high in 2018. It is down. It will be erratic. It is high. It will come down. It probably will rebound, but it will be generally a sideways trend. Sheet prices are stronger than plate or long products, and by far. And you've seen the very large spike in the US. It's actually just went over. This green line will have to be revised upward. The price as of today is $880 per metric ton for hot rolled coil in the US. So we are up into this halfway between 800 and 1,000. That is almost as bad as it was during the heart of the 232. Remember, there is idle capacity. That will not last. And when you get up to 880 a metric ton, you are far above global levels, even including a 25% tariff. So getting back to the imports question, imports will flow strongly for sheet begin in the first quarter unless these prices fall rapidly, because it is very much cheaper to buy imports than it is to buy domestic. It won't last. Capacity will be added in the US. We will actually start seeing a lot of capacity come online, and imports will fall over the second half of the year and in 2022. So high imports early, low late. Europe has gone up. China has remained fairly flat. Bar prices, much more sedate. Bar prices have been relatively flat all around the world. It is key that Europe and China have about the same level. And this green line for rebar for the United States is almost exactly 25% above the global level. So imports are purely neutral. So this should be fairly stable because imports are right at the global price plus 25%. So you have a relatively flat bar forecast going forward. They have restarted capacity in Europe. They have restarted capacity in the US. And so you are much better off. Finally, the risk. Australian cyclones, supply downside, price upside. It is the biggest risk there can be to steel. It has happened in 4 of the past 12 years. No, I am not a weather forecaster. But yes, I do know exactly what it means if bad weather hits. It has hit in 4 of the past 12 years that cyclones have hurt the ore fields of Western Australia. In 2008, prices went from $600 US per ton for hot rolled to $1,200 in a matter of less than 2 months. Prices doubled, and they stayed high until July. In 2011, they went up by 50% from 600 to 900. Recently, they go up about 20 to 30%. So it does have a very strong impact. 4 in 12 odds that it will happen, 8 in 12 that it won't. So it's a risk, not a base forecast, but it is worth watching. COVID-19, what is the supply downside, price upside? Mills close, but buyers stay open. We know of at least Burns Harbor in the US has withdrawn some capacity. They haven't closed completely, but they had to cut back. So you've cut down on sheet supply, and yet the auto companies keep buying sheet. We've also seen that coal is not flowing out of Mongolia to China, and coal prices have gone very high in China. Demand downside, price downside, that would be the auto companies close, but the mills stay open. And so that would mean less demand and prices would crash. What happened back in the early part of the year was they both fell. Demand fell, but supply fell. And then the final risk is I'm just wrong that mills do not open in 2021. They keep the mills closed. And in that case, these current sheet prices will stay high and they will be dominating the market, not just through December and early January, but for all of the first quarter. With that, I'd like to go back to Margie for questions.
Hi, John. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I am back and I am caffeinated. So at this point, we'd like to turn to the Q&A portion of our presentation today. You can find the Q&A feature on the right-hand side of your screen for you to type questions. So with that, we would like to start with the Q&A.
Margie, I cannot see the questions because I have full screen. If you could read them to me. I would appreciate it. I'm sorry.
Actually, one of the first questions that I would like to address to you is with regard to the $40 hundredweight or 880-ish short ton
Metric
sheet
ton.
prices, metric ton, excuse me. I know several months ago, everybody kind of expected that the restocking that everybody jumped into the market to start doing in late August would probably end in, late October, and that prices would start to come down. Do you think that what's going on right now, are people still restocking, or do you think prices are so high just because demand is out of whack? I'm trying to understand if people are actually restocking and trying to build inventory at current price points.
I think it is mostly a supply side issue. That demand has come back, and buyers, there is demand. I think demand is a bit too exuberant, that people are acting like COVID didn't happen. But demand is really, again, automotive is back to where it was. Most other sectors are doing there. The main thing is just that supply has not reopened. I mean, you have $880 a metric ton in the US. This is a great price, but mills are one furnace maybe coming on at the end of the year or early January. But we should be seeing every furnace getting ready to reopen at prices of $880 a metric. There's not a furnace in the United States that's not going to be profitable. And so it's really a lack of supply side response. And it is blast furnace, not electric furnace. The electric furnaces mostly are running. The blast furnaces are still idle. Again, I think they're very worried that they'll light the furnace and then COVID will break out and demand will fall again. So they're being potentially overly confident, but in doing so, they're making supply very, very tight. And that's really the biggest problem. People aren't necessarily inventory restocking right now. They're trying to find steel for current needs. So the US is the tightest. It's a bit tight in Europe. It's very tight in the US. And people are having a hard time meeting their own allocation for some products.
There has been some concern and some chatter that some of the tightness in the US domestic market might cause problems for automotive production. And there's concerns that if supply remains tight, that perhaps the automakers won't get the steel that they need. Have you heard anything to that effect? Or do you think that's something that's plausible, that they might need to slow down auto production based on sheet supply?
In conversations with people in the industry, they do believe that it is a very realistic fear, both at their part, which are parts makers, tier 2 and tier 3, but also at the OEMs, that yes, a lack of steel will cause production cuts by January. Now, they hope that steel supply will become more available. They expect that it will, but they're starting to plan for production cuts at automotive and at parts because of lack of steel. So it is reaching a very critical thing, and it is very much it's very much sheet. There is not the same problem for bar. There's not the same problem for plate. It is a sheet problem. Those are not necessarily loose markets. It's sheet that's really bad, and it's auto grade sheet that's the worst.
What do you think the impact of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the new free trade agreement signed between Asian countries such as China, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, will have on the steel market?
It will hopefully lead to a little bit more rationalization of if you have more free trade, you don't necessarily, now this is giving its most optimistic view. If I can import steel from another country easily, I don't necessarily have to build a mill I don't add to excess global capacity because I have deficit capacity in my country. The other way to look at it from a steelmaker's point of view, however, is I don't want to add some capacity and I just got undercut by imported steel. So that is, it should increase trade. And as we just saw, we actually saw China be an importer over much of the summer. And that would certainly, that helped other Asian steel markets, which were also quite weak, maybe a little bit stronger than Europe and North America, but not strong, certainly stronger than South America. But again, despite they were weaker, but because China was strong, it really helped those steel producers. And in a sideways measure, it helped steel producers in the rest of the world because they were selling to China, which meant they weren't trying to sell to North America and Europe and South America.
With some of the changes in regulation in China and with the idea that China potentially starting to import more scrap starting in January of next year, how do you think that could potentially impact scrap availability and export off the West Coast?
We've looked at some numbers and some other people have too. And quite frankly, I think it will be more of a news item than an actual problem. China will not need that many tons of import. So what should happen is that scrap prices should fall in China. That should help their electric furnace steel industry, but they should come back down to more the global average, approximately the price you'd see in Taiwan. So you'd see a price impact, but not so much a tonnage impact. And the amount of tonnage that China will import is far less than the amount of tonnage that we see going to Taiwan and Turkey and used internally in Italy and North American electric furnace market. So on a global scale, the Chinese import tonnage need is not very large, and it shouldn't impact the market much. Now, I expect market sentiment that I would expect prices to spike very sharply as people say, oh my God, China is importing scrap and it'll mess up the whole market. But in reality, it should not.
In your presentation, you noted that you expect that imports into the United States are going to increase in early 2021. Do you expect to see any additional protective measures be implemented to kind of offset that and preserve the domestic steel market?
I actually would expect protective measures to probably be status quo. If there's a bias, it would be towards some loosening. But President Trump has been a very strong protectionist president, but protectionism is normally a Democratic issue, and Joe Biden is not particularly looking, as far as we can tell, to lift these. If he does, it would be gradually. If he does, it would not. We do not expect it to be broad, and we expect, at least for the early part of 2021, mostly a status quo. Later, it is possible that if Mr. Biden does indeed become president, that he might say that he wants to improve relations with NATO allies and Japan and South Korea. And remember, the Section 232 tariffs were put in place on national defense grounds, and NATO allies are not happy being called a security threat to the United States. Joseph Biden may ease them, but that is a speculative. We have no inside evidence that he will or will not. So probably not, but we do not expect measures to get tighter. That would actually surprise us.
Okay, my final question, which is going to be the $52 million question that I'm sure a lot of people are probably thinking in the back of their heads. We still have roughly, a little bit less than 60 days left of the Trump administration. And we obviously think that trade policy and other and international relations will be different under a Biden administration. Is there concern that a 2 a.m. tweet about policy could upend the steel market, imports, tariffs, and everything else in the short term? And how much of an impact do you think that a late night tweet could potentially impact the markets until the new president or until President-elect Biden takes office?
The President Trump does actually believe that unexpected measures are good for diplomacy because it keeps your adversaries guessing. And he does have the authority. He could ban all imports potentially under Section 232. That doesn't mean he will. Please do not say that I'm saying he will do so. I am not saying that. I'm saying he has the authority to do so, but President Biden would have the authority to undo it completely on 10 minutes in after he's sworn into office on January 20. So while the President Trump has the authority under Section 232 to do almost anything, President Biden also has the authority to undo it. And if something drastic was done, if something minor is done, it might last. If something drastic is done, it would very likely be undone.
Okay, I lied. That was not my last question. There is one more. One of the attendees sent something over, and he would like to know whether you see or whether you foresee a greater shift from integrated blast furnaces to EAF production in the United States.
Absolutely. It is already happening. The United States makes year in and year out about 20 million metric tons of hot rolled thin gauge, according to World Steel. 9.3 million tons of new capacity will be online by mid-2022. It is all electric furnace. And not all of that is sheet, excuse me, that's 9.3 total. About 8.5 of it is sheet, some of it is plate, but we're going to be having an almost 40% increase in electric furnace capacity. And it will be able to undercut blast furnace. Blast furnace will be able to probably retain the very high value exposed auto body. But other than that, electric furnace will become more and more important in the US. That is a massive amount of tonnage. 8.3 million tons of sheet capacity is huge for the United States. For China, it's a Wednesday. But for the US, it's huge. And it will definitely, it will impact imports, which is why I believe it'll fall over the second half of the year, but it will also impact blast furnace production.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you again so very much for your presentation and for sharing your expertise with us today. We always appreciate your time. Take care of yourself, stay healthy, and stay safe.
Thank you.